A lot of people are worried right now that the dollar could eventually become completely worthless, and that is not without warrant because this has happened to many different civilizations in the past. Probably the most recent one was in Germany back in 1923, when people were literally pushing around wheelbarrows full of cash in order to pay for a loaf of bread. At least that's how the story goes. I wasn't there. And so today I want to talk about what happens to real estate when the US dollar collapses, because it seems like we are on this inevitable path that this is going to happen. And depending on what you do before this happens, you can either end up completely broke or massively wealthy, or at least a lot wealthier than the average person. Because the thing about inflation, especially hyperinflation, it can make all of your debts kind of disappear overnight. Like, let's say you owe $300,000 on the mortgage of your house, right? And then hyperinflation hits and you borrow a bunch of money right before that. Well, now all of a sudden you have a ton of cash to pay off that $300,000 mortgage, and it's like peanuts now because if you were to borrow that same amount of money today, it'd probably be more like borrowing $3 million. That's kind of like a great example of how this could work in your favor. But obviously, you can see the opposite way of how it can easily destroy your finances if you're not ready. And today I'm walking on Shelter Bay Avenue, and we'll be walking along the waterfront here as well in Mill Valley. Now, going back to 1923 in Germany, when the currency in Germany collapsed, all debts, including mortgage debt, were completely wiped out in real terms, kind of like the example I just gave. And borrowers could pay off homes with just a handful of worthless notes, and that's kind of how it went. And anybody who saved money or lenders back in these days got completely wiped out financially. We also saw similar patterns happen in Zimbabwe back in 2008. They experienced hyperinflation, and in Argentina, where people have been trying to preserve the value of their currency by buying property in US dollars. That's why you see so many South Americans come to Miami and buy real estate there, even at our crazy prices, because they look at it as a hedge against inflation. Because if you think the dollar is worthless, it's so much worse in South America, particularly Argentina. And so basically, the way things go is when paper money fails, people kind of flock to hard assets, and real estate is one of them. Now, so far, the US has never faced hyperinflation, but never say never, because we are on a direct path to experience it if we keep going in this direction, which we're showing no signs of slowing down. In fact, the current administration just wants to speed that up. It's kind of how it looks, especially with everything that's in the new big beautiful bill and all the spending and the tax cuts that have recently passed. In the 1970s was probably the worst bout of inflation the US has ever experienced, and fast forward to today has been the second worst, at least by the official numbers. When you go by people's real living standards and how much people's real costs of living have been going up, well, then I think that paints a different story, because the official numbers definitely don't tell the full story here. Right now, the US government owes about $37 trillion in debt, and the interest payments are now larger than the military spending. And by the end of the year, the debt is going to be the largest line item in our national budget. Think about that for a minute. So here's the problem. The debt is soon going to be unpayable, and history has shown us that you have two ways out of it. You can either inflate it away or default. And the governments in the past have pretty much always chose inflation. I just hope that one day when we get to the absolute point of no return, that somebody is level-headed enough that works in our government that can turn it all around, guys. I really hope that could be the case. It's not going to be me, unfortunately, but hopefully someone who thinks like me. So if this were to happen, inflation's obviously going to shoot through the roof. Prices of everyday goods skyrocket as the dollar's purchasing power completely evaporates, and interest rates shoot up, either to fight inflation or because lenders demand higher returns. Most likely it's going to be both. And we just saw a small preview of this recently when the Fed hiked rates and interest rates for everything went up to the point where people couldn't afford to borrow anymore. And I think this had the largest effect on corporate America, who is so used to borrowing cheap money to fuel their business model, especially investors in commercial real estate. But in a full collapse scenario, it would be total chaos. Mortgage rates would be in the double digits. There would be credit freezes across the board. Home buyers would be completely gone. But remember, like I said before, in a full out collapse scenario, when people are looking to preserve their wealth, they're probably going to flock to hard assets, which could be things like gold, silver, real estate, things you can actually touch and that you own. Real estate is kind of questionable if you really own it. You're kind of renting from the government long term since you got to pay property taxes forever, but that's a conversation for another day. So the people who are going to be winners in a scenario like this are homeowners who have fixed rate mortgages and their debts essentially get inflated away with all the cheap money, and real estate investors holding property with long-term financing. The losers are going to be renters because rents would rise fast as landlords try to keep up with inflation, although they're going to lose their tenants if they try to raise the rents that fast, and they're going to lose their property anyways, so not too smart. But theoretically, that's what a lot of landlords would try to do. We saw that during the pandemic. People who are also savers and retirees would be completely wiped out because their cash would be worthless and their fixed income would mean nothing anymore. And any banks that were holding long-term notes like mortgages would be wiped out because those loans would essentially be worthless now. So in fact, if hyperinflation comes to fruition, whoever is in the most debt actually wins, which goes completely against the financial norms. Normally right now, people who are in the most debt, at least if it's bad debt, are completely buried in it, and they can't make a single financial move without taking on more of it. People who use good debt and they use it to buy properties and create cash flow, things like that, then it's good. But most people don't do that, unfortunately. Most people are buried in credit card debt, personal loan debt, home equity loans, stuff like that. But in an all-out collapse hyperinflation scenario, the more debt you have, well, doesn't really matter because now that debt is kind of worthless. If you owe $300,000 on your house and the dollar loses 90% of its value, well, then your debt effectively shrinks down to $30,000. But there is a catch to all of this, especially if you want to come out ahead, and that is if you lose your job in the chaos, which a lot of people will, or you have an adjustable rate mortgage, you could definitely lose the house before inflation helps you. And of course, the government would try riding to the rescue as they usually do with everything else. But the problem is any of their solutions always come with a major drawback. Just like we saw with their solutions to the pandemic. Look where we ended up now because of those solutions. Nobody can afford anything anymore. And if you think it's bad now, it'll be so much worse if this all ends up happening. If they decided to cap rents so people could afford rents, put like a moratorium on rent prices going up, then it would basically destroy any incentive for a landlord to offer a property to a tenant who's willing to pay because they know they're not going to be able to recover their costs. If they did rate caps, then they would freeze lending. If they decided to print more money, then inflation gets even worse. So there's really no good solution to what they would do. They never have any good answers to any of this stuff. And the real solution is to stabilize the currency. We would have to go back on the gold standard, essentially. It could be backed by anything that is solid and anything that can't be artificially produced, but it does have to be backed by something. In the past, it was always the gold standard, and that worked very well for our country until we decided to take ourselves off of it in 1971, and we can see how well that ended for everybody. And it's hard to say what's going to happen. Like if the dollar were to collapse, are we going to see a collapse of all the other currencies around the world as well? Because a lot of other currencies rely on the dollar to value their currencies. And even with how bad the dollar is in terms of us inflating away the value, it is still the best currency in the world to hold if you're going to hold a currency. So if the dollar were to collapse, I would have a hard time thinking that any other nation's currency would still be retaining its value. But in the event that it did, you would see a lot of people come here, buy up US real estate because it would be cheap for them. This is typically what's happened in other countries where their currencies have collapsed in the past. And it's actually for a lot of these same reasons that the government doesn't ever want to see deflation, because that can make your debt even more burdensome and that can crush people's wages even faster. because people could see their wages go down if there was a lot of deflation. So essentially, we could see a lot of the socioeconomic problems that we would see with inflation with deflation. At least that's the theory. But if they would have deflation in small amounts, like they want to have inflation every year, well, that would be good for everybody. The problem is that's never going to happen because nobody ever wants less of anything. Everybody always wants more, more, and more. But I would say this, and this is the one good thing about owning real estate these days versus being a renter, is that even in an all-out collapse scenario or situation, the one good thing about your house is it is real. It is a tangible physical asset that you can actually live in, and that is worth something. Of course, property taxes and insurance would rise during this time, but the price of your house would literally become meaningless. The fact that you own it and you have a place to live would be the most valuable thing that you have in this type of situation. And this isn't to just push everybody to go out there and buy real estate. It's just kind of a preview of how things might look if something like this were to happen. But if you are interested in buying a house, always remember I have a link for you down below. And in case anybody needs a real estate agent anywhere in the country, I can hook you up with that 100% free in all 50 states. All you got to do is sign up for it and follow the prompts, and my team will handle the rest and get in touch with you ASAP. And if you use it, it helps the channel, and I really appreciate it.